Well, U.S. and Cuba are on the road to being friends again. President Obama intends to take Cuba off the terrorism list, and now Congress has a month and a half to decide if it wants to stop that process. One congressman that may be looking to block that road is Republican Florida Congressman Carlos Curbelo, and he joins us now from Miami to explain why he thinks it's a bad idea. Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman. Why do you hate it so much?
Alex, good afternoon. Look, the president's actions with regards to Cuba fit right into the rest of his foreign policy agenda. Red lines in Syria that were ignored, the famous Russian reset that resulted in disaster, sanctions relief for Iran in exchange of nothing, and now a gift to the Cuban government, where again the United States is getting very little or nothing. Think about it. In exchange for Alan Gross, a hostage that the Cuban government held unjustly for 5 years in a very cruel way, the United States has given up 3 convicted spies that had due process rights in the United States, full diplomatic relations, sanctions relief, and now removing Cuba in a political decision, removing Cuba from a list where it belongs. We have to remember that the Cuban government still collaborates with the Colombian FARC, still harbors Basque terrorists. There are fugitives of U.S. law that are living in Cuba. I mean, what are we going to get out of these negotiations?
Congressman, though, the countries that are left on the list are Iran, Sudan, and Syria. Is Cuba really as bad as those 3 countries? How can you make that case?
Cuba has very close ties to Iran. It was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad who was in Cuba in 2007, and together with Fidel Castro, they said we're going to bring the United States down on its knees. Cuba was caught shipping arms illegally to North Korea just some 18 months while the White House was conducting these secret negotiations that it did not reveal to Congress until much later on. I mean, this is no friend of the United States. There are people living in Cuba today who have murdered U.S. law enforcement officers. These are things we ought to take seriously.
But Congressman, we do have Pope Francis is considering adding a stop to Cuba on his visit to the U.S. It would be the 3rd Pope since 1998. You yourself are Catholic. I mean, if he does that, doesn't that support ties to Cuba? Wouldn't you follow your leader of the church?
I hope Pope Francis goes to Cuba. I am a big fan of Pope Francis, and even though we may disagree on our sanctions policy towards Cuba, I know this. Pope Francis condemns the conduct of the Cuban government. Pope Francis condemns the chronic human rights abuses that take place in Cuba. Pope Francis wants Cuba to stop supporting some of the most dangerous enemies of freedom and democracy throughout the world.
Well, then what kind of reassurances would you need to see if we saw this if you saw Cuba removed off the list?
The Cuban government must stop collaborating with America's worst enemies.
Which they have said that. I mean, they have denounced terrorism. So what would you need? What kind of other reassurances would you need?
Alex, the Castros have been in power for 56 years. They are both in their 80s. Do we really believe that they have changed? No. Governments like Cuba, like Iran, like Syria, like the terrorist FARC in Colombia, they are not interested in peace. They are interested in survival. The United States has gotten nothing out of its negotiations with Cuba. The United States has gotten nothing out of its negotiations with Iran.
Congressman, a very impassioned speech. Thank you so much for joining us. Republican Florida Congressman Carlos Curbelo.